Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent, wonderful. So welcome to the final session of AWS reInvent. First thing I'd like to do on behalf of everybody is thank you all for being here, for coming for this entire conference, not just for having the resilience to stay around for the final session of reInvent. I really appreciate, on behalf of all of Amazon, everybody coming and spending a few days. Hope it's been a wonderful learning experience for all of you. It certainly has been for me, just standing at the AWS booth and listening to all the different questions that people have about such a wide variety of services and offerings. And so I just hope everyone had a good time, and I hope that we can have one good final session here and send you all away, and thank you all for being here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what we are doing with Linux in EC2 overall. Eventually, I'm going to talk about the Amazon Linux AMI specifically. But I start off this session by introducing myself. My name is Max Spivak, and I want to introduce myself not as a member of the Amazon Linux AMI team, though I am, but first as someone who is concerned and responsible for the overall Linux experience that you have in EC2, right? And one of the key things to remember about Linux in EC2 is that it is still about choice, right? Open source and Linux overall have built their reputation on being about choice and letting the customer have as many options as possible. And we're trying to do the same thing in EC2, right? You guys, how many of you are currently deploying some sort of Linux instance in EC2? Okay, so all of you. And I bet you're using a wide variety of them. Some of you, I'm sure, are using the Amazon Linux AMI. I thank you for that. But my job is to make sure that whatever you're trying to do in EC2, and whatever flavor of Linux you want to use to do it, that we're making it easy for you, that we understand what your use cases are, what problems you're trying to solve, and that you have the support and ability to make that easier, to make that better, and hopefully to be able to say, gosh, doing whatever it is I'm trying to do in EC2 is a lot easier than it would be to try to do it all in bare metal or all outside of the cloud. And if you have a mixed environment, a fully EC2 environment, whatever you're trying to do, and whichever flavor of Linux you're doing it with, part of our goal within the EC2 team, especially within the EC2 team that's focused on Linux, is to try to make sure that you are able to do what you're doing and to solve your problems. So I thought it would be interesting just to talk a little bit about some of the cool things that I've seen people doing with Linux in EC2, and some of the use cases that I find particularly interesting and fun before we get into the Amazon Linux AMI itself. Just to define the terms, though, I think all of you probably know, when we say AMI, what we mean is Amazon Machine Image. Lots of people call it different things. I call it an AMI. So we mean the Amazon Machine Image, the verts that you're launching in EC2 as your customer instances. So one of the really great things that I've seen people doing in EC2, and it's a more recent thing, and especially from a Linux point of view, is we're starting to see a lot of open source projects really take advantage of EC2 for large sorts of build systems, right? We know that the upstream Linux kernel folks are beginning to use more and more EC2 instances just to do some of the large and frequent kernel builds that they need to do and they need to worry about. One of the things that is also really exciting that we've seen is some of the Linux projects that are out there, especially the ones that are trying to build community-based teams of contributors to do things like package building or quality assurance. We also see those folks leveraging EC2 within their own Linux communities and their own Linux projects, right? If you're trying to do sort of a test day of a particular feature in any particular Linux project that's getting ready to do a new release, the ease at which you can pull community members together, get them together on IRC, put together a wiki page or a mailing list to your Linux project's QA group saying, here are the features we want to test, here's the AMI ID of a current and the most recent build that has the bits that we want to try out tonight. I think another great value we see in terms of Linux and EC2 overall is giving lots of different projects the ability to leverage that. And that gets into the first sort of key point I want to make, which is Linux in EC2 is as platform agnostic as we can possibly make it, right? And you see this in a number of different places. If you look at the AWS EC2 console and you see the different Linux options that you have to launch, you'll see there's a wide variety. Stepping back a little bit, you get to AWS Marketplace, which I know there's been a number of talks about during this conference, that has even more Linux options listed, and we've added some new ones just this week. And then, of course, there's been a long-standing section of just community AMIs overall, right, that anybody in the world can build a Linux-based instance, Linux AMI, register it into EC2, people can use it. I see Eric Hammond sitting here who has done a little bit of that in his time. He's forgotten more about creating custom AMIs than I will ever know, I'm sure. So platform agnostic, we want to make sure that there are multiple options for you to use. That said, we do have, and the team that I am part of, has created an Amazon-branded entry into this collection of Linux AMIs that exists out there. And I think the first question that we really have to kind of address is, why bother, right? There have been plenty of Linux operating systems available for use long before EC2 even existed. A number of those are now available in EC2. And what was it that led us to say, well, it would be useful to have yet another Linux offering, right, as part of that mix and as one of the options that customers can have. And true to what is very core to Amazon's culture is it came based on customer requests, right? It came based on feedback that we got from our customers and our users of particular use cases that, if you look back a little over 2 years ago when we started working on the Amazon Linux AMI, we felt we needed to address. And what were some of those? Let's talk about it briefly. Number one, our customers were asking us for an AMI that they would be able to have a higher level of trust that it wasn't going to go anywhere, right? That it was maintained and supported kind of directly by Amazon. And there were fewer AMIs total available a couple years ago when we started the Amazon Linux AMI than there are now. But I think part of the concern and part of the promise that we make with the Amazon Linux AMI is it's not going anywhere, it's maintained. You don't have to wonder if the AMI that you're launching and the instances that you're creating are going to continue to be supported or have any doubt about that. It's one of the things that we're always definitely sort of looking at. Another customer request that led us to put the Amazon Linux AMI together, again, think back about 2+ years ago when we started this project, was the desire to have an RPM-based AMI available that was entirely free, right? There is no uplift charge to using the Amazon Linux AMI. The cost of it is just whatever the instance that you're launching costs. There's no additional charge for the Amazon Linux AMI, so it's effectively free once you're already using EC2. And having something that was a simple, basic, free Linux AMI that was going to be maintained and supported sort of directly by Amazon is something that a number of customers were asking us for, and it kind of led us to the original idea of putting this AMI together. Also, it's important to note that the Amazon Linux AMI, it's called the Amazon Linux AMI. It doesn't exist outside of EC2. The only place you can use it is in the EC2 environment. Okay, and for some people, that doesn't quite meet the use case that you need, right? Some of you have a mixed deployment environment where you have machines both inside and outside of the cloud, and part of what you're trying to do there is that you want to have, you know, as close to exactly the same flavor of Linux running on all of that as necessary, and that's part of what I was getting at earlier when I talked about wanting to make sure that EC2 offers you a lot of choice in your Linux environment, offers you a lot of options. But because the Amazon Linux AMI is only in EC2, we're also able to kind of do a few things with it that are cloud-focused in mind, that are also AWS-focused in mind. I'll kind of get into that a little bit more later on, but I wanted to sort of give a baseline of what the Amazon Linux AMI is and a little bit of why we decided to create it. A little over 2 years ago, we had our first release of the Amazon Linux AMI kind of in the fall of 2010. It was a year after that, last September, that we converted it from being sort of a public beta to we sort of stuck the GA tag on it and said, we're ready to call this sort of a finished and polished release. And now, a year later, we continue to iterate. Approximately every 6 months, we're doing a new release of the Amazon Linux AMI. And so that's kind of where we are right now. This slide is going to be a little more sort of about some of the philosophy around what we do with the Amazon Linux AMI, and a little bit now of saying, well, we call this thing the Amazon Linux AMI, but what does that really look like when you start to break it apart and when you start to dissect it? Don't really worry too much about the AMI IDs in the middle. Rather, I want to first start by talking about the rows and columns, right? And naturally, the first thing to call out here is we've got a list of all the different regions that AWS supports. And one of the promises that we make to you with the Amazon Linux Army is that it will be available in any new region that Amazon launches the day that that region also launches. Now, that is a promise, well, that is a statement that I personally would like to have be true about really all of the Linux options that are in EC2, right? And one of the things, in addition to working on the Amazon Linux Army, that I and some of my colleagues do is work with some of the other Linux providers to try to help make sure that they can have their stuff ready as close to the launch day of a new region as possible as well. And we've been very successful with that across the board. But the slightly key difference, of course, being that because AWS takes care of the Amazon Linux Army from front all the way to back, if that's not available the day a new region launches, right, we have no one to blame but ourselves. But of course, we're trying to make sure, and we will make sure, that the Amazon Linux Army is available in every region that Amazon supports. Going across the top of the screen, when you look at the different columns, what this begins to do is sort of talk about sort of the different flavors that the Amazon Linux Army then kind of gets customized or broken down into. And really what this has to do with is all of the different instance types that are available across AWS. And the other promise that we make to you is that there will be a flavor of the Amazon Linux Army that can run on every single instance type that Amazon offers, right? That, coupled with availability on the first day in every single region, sort of makes sure that we have comprehensive coverage of the Amazon Linux Army, and that any instance type in any region, you're going to be able to have, at the very least, the Amazon Linux Army running on it. A few words about these different columns, though most of you probably already have a very good sense about them. The two columns on the right represent, of course, Amazon's HVM instance types, and I know that there's been a number of talks this past 2 days that talk about the different instance types we have. If there are any sort of remaining questions about what we mean when we talk about HVM instances versus the 4 columns on the left, which are the para-virtualized instances, I'll be happy to talk with you about that after the session. But we've got HVM instance types. We've got on the far right our GPU AMI, which comes with drivers that are going to help support your OpenCL and your CUDA work built in directly to the AMI, right? Part of our idea here is we want to make sure that your customer pain, right? You guys deal with Linux for a living. You're used to pain. Pain is okay, but we want to lessen it, right, as much as possible, right? We don't want you to have to install or change anything to be able to use the graphics functionality on your cluster graphics instances. At the same time, if you're just looking for the compute horsepower that, you know, the basic HVM instance type gives you, like your CC2 instance type, for example, and you don't want that graphic stuff, we've got a separate flavor of the Amazon Linux Army that gives you that. And then for both the S3-backed and the EBS-backed instance types, we have both 32 and 64-bit AMI flavors available, sort of just depending on what it is that you're looking for. So the key things that I want to ask you guys to take away from this just is, again, going back to the fact that one of the promises that we make about the Amazon Linux Army is availability across all the instance types, availability across all the regions, day one. And if that's ever something that we're dropping the ball on or that isn't working the way you guys expect, the last slide of this deck is going to have my email address, and I think a recurring theme you're going to hear from me is that I really want your feedback, and I'm really interested in knowing, especially those of you who are using the Amazon Linux Army, what can we make better? What can we do to improve your customer experience? Because a lot of the way we decide what our roadmap is based on the things that you guys ask us for. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So, where are we next? So, no discussion of a Linux system is complete without having a discussion about sort of what we do kind of from a security point of view. And the next little while of this talk is going to be sort of security philosophy, going into what our updates philosophy is, a little bit about how our repositories are put together, and then kind of getting back to a few slides ago where I talked about how the Amazon Linux Army is a rolling release, what we really mean by that, and kind of where you guys as customers and users have some flexibility related to that. So we're going to kind of talk through all of that over the next little while, but I want to start just by talking about security. Actually, I'm not ready for this slide yet, but I'll leave it there. You can look at it. A few quick things, easy to say, quick to say, but of importance, right? One of the first things that's worth knowing about the Amazon Linux Army, no root login by default. We create a basic EC2-user, a non-root user for you. that you can log in on. The SSH public key that gets passed when you launch your instance is dropped into the authorized keys file in your instance, and you can log in and sudo to root if you want to. There's also no password login by default. You have to SSH in, and you have to SSH in as non-root. That's just part of our general idea to make sure that the vectors of entry into the AMI are as small as possible. Another thing we do to try to sort of reduce the scope of the security burden on the AMI before you even start to use it as a customer is just minimizing the package set by default as much as possible. One of the things that we look at every time we put together a new release of the Amazon Linux AMI is what are the packages that are installed on this thing by default? What of those can we trim and make available in the repositories? But how do we keep the services that are on your basic image as low as possible, and then just make it extensible for the users kind of based on what you want? It also means that it just also means that overall you're going to have less worry about applying updates kind of on the initial launch of an AMI. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about what happens when you make the initial launch of an Amazon Linux AMI. And okay, well, let's look over here and talk about what happens when you do the initial launch of the Amazon Linux AMI. You'll see on the screen that this is just a snapshot of some of the listings on our security bulletin page, and there's an RSS feed there if anyone wants to be subscribed to that. And what you'll see here, and what's going to be important, I'm going to flip back between this slide and the next one, is where we're talking about the severity of these different items. You'll see some mediums, some importance, some lows. We are constantly, our team is monitoring the usual open source community, Linux community security feeds, all the way from upstream projects. We also look at what other Linux projects are doing and the security updates that they're issuing, and we're tracking all of that and evaluating everything in the context of the Amazon Linux AMI and issuing and building security updates when necessary. So we're very much part of that larger Linux community security process, and we look at all of the things that are being released upstream and the severity that those get within the context of the Amazon Linux AMI. For instance, right, if there's a kernel vulnerability that is only exploitable, in a USB port, that's not something we're going to worry about for the kernel on the Amazon Linux AMI. So that's going to be downgraded in terms of severity, as opposed to if you were sort of running the same kernel on a bare metal machine that people kind of have access to. But for the most part, we follow the same security evaluations that the upstream community does. And what we do in order to try to make sure that your AMI is as secure as it can be, while still being flexible, is when you launch a new AMI, we install automatically on the first boot of your AMI any critical or important security updates that are in our repository. So I want to kind of call out, if you look up here, you'll see there's sort of three sections to this slide. The first part is the MOTD, the message of the day, of a freshly launched Amazon Linux AMI instance. And in bold, you'll see it says there are 3 security updates out of 29 total updates available. So what that means, right, is that from the time after, this is a 2012-09 Amazon Linux AMI. So this is our most recent release of the Amazon Linux AMI. And from the time that AMI was built, which if you look at the very bottom of the slide, you can see the last packages that were installed during the build of the AMI was on October 8th. From the time since that AMI was built until the time that I launched the AMI, we'd issued 29 updates overall to the Amazon Linux package repositories. Now that could be a combination of some security updates, some bug fix updates. There was a new build of some of the Amazon API command line tools, and we package those up, and we made an update to the repository. So it's a collection of updates that are sort of what you would expect in any sort of Linux repository. And there's 3 security updates that are sitting there waiting to be installed. The middle section of this slide shows you some more information about that, and you can see number 134 and number 139, the libxml and the Ruby. If we go back and look on the previous slide, you can compare that. You can see at the very bottom we've got the libxml2, number 134. At the top we've got number 139, the Ruby. Those are pending installation. They're waiting to be installed. Why? Because their severity is medium, so those weren't installed by default for you when the AMI launched. Conversely, take a look in the middle where we've got the Java 1.6 vulnerability, number 136, and the bind vulnerability, number 138. Going back here and looking at the bottom of the screen where you can sort of see the changes that have been made to the RPM manifest on the system, there you've got your Java update and your bind update. They were installed automatically when the AMI launched, and you can see that represented. Now, the only things that remain here is the Java 1.7 vulnerability and the Puppet vulnerability. Those don't appear anywhere because those are packages that are just in the repository. They're not installed by default on the AMI. So if you were to yum install either of those packages, you'd get, of course, the most updated version. And similarly, if I had launched an AMI and if I had launched an older AMI and I had Puppet installed, for example, and then we issued a security update, when that message of the day refreshes, and I think it refreshes something like every 15 minutes or something like that, it's going to get updated and show you that there's another update pending. So this is kind of what we do to try to limit any sort of critical or important vulnerabilities from being present on your AMI at the time that you launch it. It's our attempt to make sure that the AMI is as secure as possible when you get your hands on it. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about how you can sort of modify this behavior and change it a little bit if you'd like to do so. Before I get into that, though, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that right now we are in the habit of pushing updates to the Amazon Linux AMI repositories about once every 2 weeks. It depends on what sort of security vulnerabilities are out there in the larger open source Linux community, and some of them, in particularly, if there's something that's a critical or an important, a lot of times we'll build that and get that pushed out as soon as we have it tested. But you'll find that generally when we get kind of customer requests for non-security updates, or can you just package a new thing and stick it in the repositories for us, we're kind of in the habit right now of doing that about every 2 weeks, and that's something that we're planning over the course of the next year. I think when we all get back together next year and we look at what's happened with the Amazon Linux AMI, you're going to see that we've sped that up considerably, and one of our goals is to make sure that we're doing repository pushes much more quickly. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that another thing that we look at and constantly evaluate is the need to build a new AMI overall, right? I mentioned on one of the first slides that we make a new release of the Amazon Linux AMI approximately every 6 months. However, we look at the security updates that are happening in the open source community, in the Linux community. If necessary, we will build a point release of the AMI and get that out just because we want to refresh everything and not have people even have to worry about getting updates applied. So it's time to give some credit to one of our colleagues in the Linux world, the Ubuntu community, for a wonderful upstream project called CloudinIt. If you're familiar with CloudinIt, please raise your hand. Okay, so some of you, but not all of you, which means that this part should be a little bit interesting. So CloudinIt is a process, again, it was an upstream that was created by the Ubuntu community. It's something that has started to spread into other Linux projects as well. A couple years ago, when we first put the Amazon Linux AMI together, one of the things that we did was add RPM support into CloudinIt, which at the time didn't exist. And what CloudinIt really is just a process that's running, and it's part of the boot process of a new instance being created. And it's able to look at the metadata that's available to the instance. It's also able to respond to user data, right? And when we talk about user data, that's passed in either as a text file on the command line to your EC2 run instances command, or if you are launching your instances from the AWS console, there's a little section somewhere in the wizard where you can paste in your CloudinIt user data. But it's just text, right? And it can take any form. It could be a script. You know, it starts with a shebang and just has whatever stuff you want it to do. Or it can take the form of what I'm showing you on this slide, which is a form called cloud config data. But whatever your user data is, it's going to be executed as root as part of the launch process of your AMI, and it's used to kind of configure things and be able to make some choices and customize your AMI without having to change, you know, the AMI itself. One of the things, I alluded to this earlier, that we use CloudinIt for in the Amazon Linux AMI is placing your SSH public key in the authorized keys file in your .ssh directory, right? It queries the metadata, it grabs the public key, it sticks it in the right place. The other thing that we use CloudinIt for is allowing people, is how we allow you guys to change, if you like, the way the security updates are installed by default on your AMI. And I want to draw your attention to the third line of this slide, the repo upgrade all line, right? And what that says If you were to pass this user data into your Amazon Linux AMI, what that really says is, okay, that's nice that you guys will update, critical or important advisories for me by default, but I really just effectively want to do a yum update -y when I launch a new instance. And so passing in user data of repo upgrade all says, just check and update everything that you possibly can. Now that'll potentially, depending on where we are in our release cycle, right? If it's the day after we've released and there haven't been a lot of updates in the repository, that's not going to take very long. If it's the day before our next release and there's a ton of updates in the repository, that does have the chance to slow down a little bit sort of the total time from saying, give me an instance to SSH is up, because this upgrade, the check for updates and the installation of security updates happens before we turn SSH on. In case there's an update to SSH, we want to make sure we've gotten the latest version of it. And that's also part of why our default choice has been to only install critical or importance by default. It's a balance between limiting exposure while not slowing down too much the amount of time before your SSH prompt is up. You can set that to all if you want everything. You can set it to none if you don't want it to do any installation for you and you want to have complete and total control from the first moment of what updates are installed on your machine or not. The second part of this cloud config user data, and again, you could do all of this as a script, but the user data sort of makes it a little bit easier for people to make some of these choices without having to even do any sort of scripting, sort of shows a very basic example of, I kind of want to turn my instance automatically into something that begins to resemble a LAMP stack, right? You're telling it, okay, go out and use yum to install Apache, to install MySQL, to install PHP, and then down at the bottom, of course, you're telling it, well, turn Apache on and set it so that Apache will come on by default and that service will start up if the AMI gets rebooted. So that's kind of a basic example of some of the things that you can do with CloudinIt user data in the Amazon Linux AMI. The line that I still haven't addressed yet, though, and that we need to talk about, and this is going to now start to transition us from a discussion of the way we handle security updates in the Amazon Linux AMI to the idea of the Amazon Linux AMI being a rolling release, is this line near the top, the second line that says repo release ver 2012-09. So a brief digression into the way we handle our repositories and what we mean by we talking about the Amazon Linux AMI as a rolling release. I like the metaphor kind of just a river, right? And the Amazon Linux AMI is a river of packages and a river of software that comes together, of course, and we have entry points onto it, but everyone eventually ends up in the same place, right? And if you launch a 2011 Amazon Linux AMI or a 2012-03 Amazon Linux AMI or a 2012-09 Amazon Linux AMI, no matter how old of an AMI you launch, if you're running yum update, you're going to end up basically in the same place. So if you're keeping your AMI up to date, everyone's experience is going to be more or less the same. And that's by choice, right? Not everybody wants that. Not everybody's used to that kind of a rolling release where you always end up kind of at the same thing. But we very strongly just have a concept of the latest Amazon Linux AMI. And the images themselves are just sort of snapshots in time to make it easier for you to get to the latest place, right? Maybe someday down the road we'll be having a new version, a new point release of the Amazon Linux AMI, at a much higher frequency to basically make it so that people don't have to worry about updates at all. But right now, this is the model that we've chosen, which is consistent releases with a repository structure that keeps everybody up to date. Now, that said, there are some potential pitfalls in a rolling release like this where you guys are all one bad package push from us away from being broken, right? And we don't want that to happen to you, in particular when we go from one version of the Amazon Linux AMI to another. Let's assume, hypothetically, come March of 2013, when we put out the next version of the Amazon Linux AMI, that we want to move from the 3.2 kernel to the 3.4 kernel. Perhaps, you guys as customers, you trust us, but you want to do some of your own testing before you move all of your systems to the 3.4 kernel as well. That's where this release version part of the cloud config data comes into play. It allows you to lock your AMI to a specific version of our repositories. So it's kind of, we've got a few exit ramps off of this river. Well, it should be a highway if we're talking about entry and exit ramps. But anyway, we've got a few exit ramps built in as well as entry points. So you can basically say, I want to pause my Amazon Linux AMI instances at a certain point in time and lock them to the 2012-09 repositories or the 2012-03 repositories or whichever version of those repositories, and you're not going to get updates beyond the last state of those repositories before we released the next version of the Amazon Linux AMI. So you're basically able to sort of pause the flow of updates and consume them as you're ready, as you want to, right? You can set Yum's release version specifically on the command line to latest and pull in, okay, I just want to check out the new kernel and see how that's working. And you can gain whatever sort of testing or confidence you want to do without having to update everything all at once. And then when you're ready, you can move your AMIs back to latest and carry on with the flow of updates. Now, the only sort of caveat that I would give to you guys in terms of using the lock-on-launch feature is if you wait a long time, if you lock to a particular version of our repositories and never unlock from them, that's not a lot different. In fact, it's not different at all from basically using any flavor of Linux that's kind of gone end of life, right? We are only supporting and we are only maintaining the latest state of the Amazon Linux AMI. It would be as if you installed, Red Hat Linux 7.2 and wondered why there were no more updates available, right? So it's a good tool for temporarily getting off of the flow of updates for testing purposes, for evaluation purposes, but we highly encourage everyone to make sure they're consuming the updates that we offer to the Amazon Linux AMI. So let's talk for a minute about the package set that goes into the Amazon Linux AMI overall and where that came from, the choices that we've made around that, and kind of how that fits into the larger EC2 ecosystem. And I want to go back, and it's important to me to reiterate that the Amazon Linux AMI is just one of several options that exist for Linux and EC2. And that what we care about most at Amazon is making sure that your Linux and EC2 experience is a good one, regardless of which flavor of Linux you choose to use. So the Amazon Linux AMI, I think, fills a little bit of a niche that also makes it useful and that also speaks to why it was valuable for us to create it. Now, let's look for a moment kind of at the continuum of what happens in the Linux distribution world. And you'll know, especially let's look at the kind of the RPM side of that. And you've got projects whose job is to innovate as quickly as possible, to push the envelope of what's available and what you can do with open source, with Linux, right? The purpose of these particular Linux projects is to break things, to have everything be up for grabs, and to innovate as quickly as possible. You've got another side, which is a conservative sort of enterprise. We want to make sure that core functionality is going to work. We don't want to change things very much at all. And those are your two extremes. I think that the Amazon Linux AMI sort of fits a little bit in the middle of that. And again, we want you to use whatever makes sense for your situation. But I think the Amazon Linux AMI sort of fits in the middle. When we first put it together, we certainly started with the idea of an enterprise-compatible sort of Linux offering, right? We want to make sure that a lot of different things are going to work for you right out of the box. We want to make sure that we've got a stable base and that we're providing one. We want the Amazon Linux AMI to be able to take advantage of the extra packages for enterprise Linux repository, something started by our friends in the Fedora project. At the same time, one of the things I said earlier, and it could not be more true, is that our innovation happens based on your customer requests, right? The request is not to pull everything from the entire Linux world and innovate as fast as possible in the Amazon Linux AMI, because there's already Linux projects that are doing that. But you guys have asked us for specific things. Give us a 3.x version of the kernel. Give us multiple versions of some core packages like Java, like Ruby, like Python, like GCC, like databases, things like that. So I think about it as you've got this giant mass of innovation that's happening in the Linux world, and different projects sort of curate that innovation at whatever speed they want. And we're trying to find kind of a middle ground in the Amazon Linux AMI where you've got a stable base. If you've got some older code that was written for Python 2.4, it's going to work on the Amazon Linux AMI. If you need to be able to have Python 2.4 and Python 2.6 installed at the same time, we've enabled that for you as well, right? We're making multiple versions of core packages available that can live in parallel. We're able to pick and choose the innovation that we ingest into the Amazon Linux AMI to respond to your customer requests, but we're also trying to make sure that we keep sort of that stable, broad enterprise base. And that's what I mean when I kind of say that the Amazon Linux AMI sort of sits in the middle. One of the other ways that we sort of are starting to use more and more in terms of offering sort of innovation to our customers between releases of the Amazon Linux AMI. One of the things that we've added into the Amazon Linux AMI repository structure in the last little while is a preview repository. And on your yum command line, you could do yum -- enable repo equals preview, list available, and you're going to see. Well, we're getting ready, for example. I'll give you guys a quick heads up. In our next repository push that we do for the Amazon Linux AMI, we're going to be pushing a newer version of Git into that preview repository, again, based on a customer request. So someone was asking for Git 1.8. We got it built. We're going to stick it in the preview repository, let the customer try it out, kind of make sure everything's working right, and then either that's kind of a small update, so either out of bounds or when we do the next larger Amazon Linux AMI release, we'll then pull that into our main repository. So we're starting to use our preview repository as a way to let customers who are asking for specific things sort of get access to those, try them out, make sure they work, while not necessarily throwing them directly into the main repository, especially if it's an upgrade of an already existing package, because we're sensitive to kind of what that rolling release sort of means. For instance, we're not going to, I alluded earlier to the fact that we're looking at, one of the things we're evaluating and looking at is the 3.4 kernel for our March 2013, more or less, Amazon Linux AMI release. We're not going to push, even if we were ready with that and we had the kernel that we wanted, we're not going to push that into the Amazon Linux AMI updates repository midstream. That's just too big of a change, right? That's not sort of the philosophy that we're trying to go with the Amazon Linux AMI. We're trying to keep things stable while bringing that innovation to you guys in sort of a responsible and curated kind of way. So I hope that all kind of makes sense. Again, it's about selectively picking the stuff that's going on in the larger Linux community, making it available to you guys, and sort of blending it into the base that already exists and keeping that sort of stable and broad as much as we can. The other thing that is worth mentioning, of course, is that the Amazon Linux AMI comes pre-installed and pre-configured for a wide variety of AWS command line tools and API tools that hopefully you're using as you interact with other AWS services. I think one of the nice sort of value adds here, and it's one of the things that, again, is an opportunity that exists because the Amazon Linux AMI is only in EC2, is to put that stuff on the AMI by default, to have it set up so you don't have to fight with configuring Java and downloading zip files of all the different tools and getting all that in. We've got it all packaged up, and you can install those as you need them. If there's something that we don't have, right? If there is an AWS service that has a command line tool that for some reason we don't have in our repository, tell me. Email me at the end, come up here and yell at me afterward, because we want to make sure we make that available to you guys. One of our key goals with the Amazon Linux AMI is to make sure that it can be your entry point into other parts of AWS, again, with as little pain as possible and making that easy for you. Couple final points. Another thing that I think is worth talking about with the Amazon Linux AMI and our design philosophy, keeping it simple, keeping it extensible. Like I said, we try to make our AMIs by default as usable as possible while also kind of being small. I think that one of the things that customers have asked us for also is, I need a starting point, right? I'm starting to look at making AMIs myself, or I want to be able to customize a Linux AMI and do some other things with it. Where do I start? What should I look at? The Amazon Linux AMI is also sort of meant to be a nice reference for people who want to see what a pretty minimal kind of EC2 AWS aware AMI looks like. Either you can extend that yourselves and rebundle it, or if you're looking to build your own AMIs from scratch, at least kind of use it as a reference point or a checkpoint to see some of the things that we've done. Oops, wrong button. There's many ways, of course, to get a list of packages that exist in our repositories. You can use yum to do it, but for those of you who like to look at things on the internet or don't have an AMI currently launched, one of the other pages that we publish is a list of all the source RPMs that are in the Amazon Linux AMI, and you can see the URL for it there. What I like about this particular screenshot of that page is it also allows me to make another statement kind of about a good example of where we try to respond very quickly to your customer requests, right? We had a customer that was asking for a specific version of the 389 directory server. We were able to get that packaged up and get that into the Amazon Linux AMI and make that available to them. Again, if you guys have packages that you're looking for that you would like to see in the Amazon Linux AMI repositories that aren't there right now, please let me know, and we're going to do what we can. We've started small, right? We're going to grow the Amazon Linux AMI package set based on your guys' requests, based on things that our team wants or thinks that need to go in there as well. But there's only about 1,400 or 1,500 packages in the Amazon Linux AMI repository right now. Compare that to Debian, right? Compare that to Fedora. It's a lot less. That's by choice, and we're going to grow it as we need it, but we're also trying to sort of make sure that we're giving you guys what you need, but not everything until customers are asking us for it. So the last thing I want to kind of talk about and mention related to the Amazon Linux AMI, like I said, it's free. There's no uplift charge, right? If you're launching an EC2 instance, that's it. You pay what your EC2 instance costs, and you can use the Amazon Linux AMI to your heart's content. We are 100% committed to supporting it and to supporting your usage of it. There's two different ways that we do that. One, of course, is on the EC2 forums. Everyone who's part of the Amazon Linux AMI team is monitoring those forums every day. We have an on-call rotation where somebody's job is to make sure they're looking at that every day and responding to issues, not only looking for Amazon Linux issues, but also looking for issues that people are having with other Linux AMIs in EC2. Like I said, we want to try to make sure that everybody's Linux experience is as good as we can make it. We have a wonderful AWS dev support team that also looks at the forums and, as necessary, alerts us to any issues that we haven't seen. So if you're kind of a developer, if you're an individual user, if you are just starting to play around and having issues and want, again, a free way to bring your questions or your requests or your bugs to the attention of myself or the team that's working on it, you can post on the EC2 forums, and especially if you put Amazon Linux AMI in your subject line of your thread or somewhere in there, we'll certainly find it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the overall AWS premium support offering as well. We spend a lot of time working, again, with our support groups on customers who are AWS premium support folks and who are having issues with the Amazon Linux AMI, or who are trying to really tune it or make it perform in a very specific way or a very specific use case. So there's two support options for you, kind of the free one and then sort of the more enterprisey one, depending on what your needs are. And again, we want you to use it. We want you to use Linux and EC2 overall. If this is the choice that's right for you, wonderful. Tell me how we can make it better. If there's another Linux choice that's the best one for you in EC2, we want to help with that as well. We love Linux, all of it. And I want to, again, just thank you for coming and listening to me talk about the Amazon Linux AMI overall. And I hope you guys had a wonderful time at reInvent, and I hope we can reconvene next year.